Welcome to this GSK Human Performance Lab webcast on the science of polar exploration. I'm Ken Van Sommeren, Head of Research and Development, and I'm joined today by Richard Parkes, ex-international rugby player and now extreme environment athlete. Richard, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Ken, thanks for having me.
So at the GSK Human Performance Lab, we recently had the privilege of supporting Richard in his preparation for an incredibly ambitious bid to break the speed record to the South Pole. Richard, perhaps you could start us off just by telling us in your own words some of the preparation you went through for this and then some of the details of the expedition itself.
Absolutely, Ken, yeah. In my opinion, performance, whether that be in a controlled environment of elite sport or business or the most hostile environments on the planet, it all comes down to detail, and I'm really passionate to be able to share the detail of Antarctica with you guys today. My journey here, though, started 6 years ago as a professional rugby player, and I've got a video to share with you guys.
He played for a number of clubs, including Pontypridd and Newport Gwent Dragons, and was capped 4 times for Wales. But a serious injury to his shoulder brought his playing career to a premature end. From the disappointment and despair of being unable to pursue his passion for the game, he turned to a different outlet for his energies.
The bottom dropped out of my world when I was forced to retire from professional rugby due to a career-ending shoulder injury. That was a really difficult period for me. It was a dark period, and I guess a period that many other high-performance athletes and other people in today's economic society can relate to. But it was a sentence from my late grandmother's funeral that became a bit of a strapline for the project, and also gave me the courage and the inspiration to channel my energies into something positive. And that really was the catalyst for my 737 challenge. For those that don't know, 737 stands for 7 summits, 3 poles, and 7 months. The 7 summits are the highest mountain on each of the world's 7 continents. The 3 poles refer to the geographical North Pole, the geographical South Pole, and the summit of Mount Everest, widely regarded as the world's 3rd pole, the 3rd most inaccessible point on the planet. The preparation for that was brutal, and as a rugby player, I guess the only people's opinion I really cared about were obviously those of my family, but my teammates, the people in the changing room. And integrity underpins everything that I do now. And that, from rugby to mountains to extreme environments, there is no difference. And I spent 18 months preparing for the 737 challenge. Believe it or not, I'd never climbed a technical mountain at that point. But of those 18 months, I spent 10 of them in a tent on expedition, amassing a lifetime of mountaineering skills and decision-making abilities, because the challenge for me was learning how to climb. I didn't want to be short roped or carried up the mountain. For me, it was actually about doing it. I funded all of this early training myself, using my life insurance. No, I'm still alive. Using my insurance policy for my injury, my life savings, sold pretty much everything that I owned, and even moved back in with my parents, which I always joke about. Of all the challenges I've gone through the last 5 or 6 years, that probably is one of the toughest. But on July the 12th, 2011, I completed my 737 challenge and became the first ever person to climb the 7 summits and stand on the North and the South Pole and the summit of Everest in the same calendar year. In fact, I completed it in just under 7 months. And I've got some highlights from the BBC Wales doco that went out to share with you guys today.
And that's just brutal, with nothing to judge your progress or, no stimuli visual. The line if I said it wasn't absolutely shattered. Summit Mount Vincent. The summit of Aconcagua, the highest mountain outside of the Himalayas. This is brutal, and it's only day one.
4,800 metres of technical rock climbing. Oh, it's been tough. Well, we're on our own now. Steve and myself have stood on the geographical North Pole. What an amazing feeling. You've just got to keep our nerve. You've got to stay strong, stay focused. It's just the most amazing feeling. You know, it's 50-50 that I'm going to make it to Denali. And even worse than that, it's 50-50 whether I'm actually going to lose my toe or not. Just dropped through a crevasse and a big one. Oh God, that was so scary. Should I cut it off?
I don't know.
Been an adventure getting you. Last one to go. Obviously, I'm really proud of that achievement, but even more than pride, I'm incredibly grateful. Grateful for the opportunity to have been able to attempt it, for all the people that helped me along the way to help me achieve it, but mostly grateful for still being involved in high performance sport and still being able to perform at the very top of my field. And it's really, it opened the door, it's the catalyst to this chapter of my life and I guess my journey here to you guys this morning. In 2012 though, I'd highlighted a project that I really wanted to attempt, and that was to be a part of Antarctic history, to set a standard in Antarctica. And 2012 started for me with a series of expeditions developing and designing kit that would be appropriate for that expedition, because very little is suitable off the shelf. I designed a cooking system that saved me over 2 kilograms of payload of fuel. I worked with my sponsor RAB to develop new clothing systems and even tested tents in Alaska and South America to get the optimum equipment for the Antarctica project that I was planning on attempting. 2012 culminated in my first solo expedition in Antarctica. It was just under 40 days solo, unsupported, in a research and development expedition, testing my equipment, also testing the route and my systems, and it was brutal, if I'm being honest. I got a lot right, but I also got a lot wrong. And it was at this point that I really highlighted that I needed the support of the GSK team, and I'm also really happy and excited to be saying this is where we started working and started working together. I got back from that first expedition in Antarctica with a few injuries. I had a frostbitten nose from a mistake on day 37, incredibly fatigued, emaciated, and really my cognitive function not really where it should be. I lost over 16 kilos of body weight, just really highlighting that my fueling system wasn't right. And also I had some unilateral injuries and features that were really caused by the prevailing wind and my prone pulling position of the sled. And it's really interesting actually, because working with my physio, now performance director, Dr. Nicola Phillips, actually was a conversation over why my nose was more frostbitten on one side than the other that really helped us diagnose all this and highlight that the prevailing wind would have an impact, and we really needed to address this in the year's preparation. We highlighted that there were three main areas to focus on in the final year leading up to the expedition. The first obviously was injury prevention. Being able to ski for 10, 12, 14 hours a day once is one thing. Being able to repeat that for 29, 30 plus days is something different. And injury prevention, resilience was going to be crucial. Recovery obviously was going to be huge. Once again, being able to repeat that level of exertion day in, day out. And also the psychological confidence, because one thing about performing solo in that sort of environment is it's as much a psychological challenge as it is a physical challenge. In fact, it's pretty brutal. So working at Sport Wales, we looked at firstly addressing my biomechanical stability, really working backwards to break my movement patterns down so that I was more efficient and ultimately more injury resilient. That turned into what started off as rehab, turned into prehabilitation and an evolution into functional strength work, and all with the mindset of being able to transfer this from the environment, from the lab. I love this photo of me running. I'm not a runner, but I actually look like one in this photo, fair play. Obviously to this, it was all about transferring it on the ice in the expedition. The clicker. 2013, was all about a series of high performance and extreme races to help me prepare. This was part of my deprivation training. It's something that I live by. It's something that I utilize for every expedition that I attempt. And what I mean by deprivation training is putting myself in an uncomfortable physiological or psychological condition or environment so that I benefit as much mentally as I do physically from this. The first race, believe it or not, 2 weeks after coming back from Antarctica, 16 kilos down in body weight, a shadow of the man that I was. The first was a mountain bike race called the Yak Attack in the Himalayas in Nepal. 440 kilometers over 9 days, a stage race, topping out at 5,500 meters. So absolutely brutal. I love Nepal and I love cycling. On paper, I thought I'd have loved it, but actually this was a really tough event. But what I learned from this event really informed a lot of the year, really just on, this was the beginning of developing the recovery strategies that I would employ throughout the year and in Antarctica. We all know recovery really comes down to sleep and food. And I realized then that, I really needed to manage my diet and my fueling strategy, not just in Antarctica, but throughout the year. If I was going to get any benefit from these three races, these three projects, I'd have to stay injury-free and I'd have to come home in a state that I was able to build on what I'd achieved in that event. So working with the guys here at the GSK HPL, I did sweat analysis in the environmental chamber, and working with the dietitians and the physiologists, I really came up with a fueling strategy that was both specific for each event, because each event had different requirements, but with the mindset to be able to apply all of this into Antarctica. And these photos just obviously show some of the bits from the environmental chamber. That was around -30, that photo there. On the left, the photo in the middle is working with another one of my partners, Fusion, developing bespoke meals for Antarctica, but using all the information and all the guidance from the dietitians here at the HPL. And finally, weight is everything. My preparation is meticulous, and that all came down to cramming. We decided on the optimum calorie count of 5,815 calories a day, and it all came down to cramming that into as a lighter payload as possible per day. The second event or race was an ultra marathon in the Peruvian Amazon jungle, and after climbing Carstensz Pyramid, the Australasian Continental Summit in my 737 challenge, I promised myself I'd never go back to a jungle. Absolutely horrific. Everything's alive, the humidity, the sweat. True to my deprivation training, I picked this event because quite simply it was horrible and I didn't want to do it. I'm not a runner. The idea of running 250 kilometers over 5 days, approximately a marathon a day and 2 on the last day, self-supported, in almost 100% humidity, 40 degrees centigrade, was horrific. But actually, it was a really, really valuable experience for me, not just psychologically, but also managing the camera systems that I would need and the skills that I would need to manage the cameras in Antarctica, because I was filming all of this for a Channel 5 documentary that comes out just next month, and I was self-filming, so being able to manage the camera systems was going to be a vital part of the expedition. And although the challenge of humidity and heat in the Peruvian Amazon jungle was very different to Antarctica, the skills are transferable. Also as well, the recovery systems that I began to develop here in the GSK HPL and in the Yakutak, now I was being able to employ them in Peru, in the field, and in a self-supported environment. And obviously my nutrition played a huge part in that. Being able to sleep in a hammock was another really big part when everybody else on the other racers couldn't. And also my Firefly devices and compression devices that I did take on the ice in Antarctica. Obviously this entire year was underpinned by thorough physiological testing to monitor my progress and help tweak my training, tweak my aerobic preparation as much as my prehabilitation and physiological strength work. Also as well, some of the events, I won't get into it too much, but some of these testing, although there was a huge scientific objective, actually what I gained from it psychologically and from a confidence perspective was really fascinating too. The final race was really the most, was genuinely a tough event. It's called the Brutal. It's a word that I use a lot, and it really did say exactly what it did on the tin. It was a double Ironman set in Snowdonia in God's country in North Wales. 4-mile swim, although actually I broke my hand in a training at altitude in the Alps. I fell off my bike, and I wasn't able to complete the swim, which maybe it was a godsend, maybe wasn't. At the time, it was mega stressful, followed by 230 miles on the bike, and 2 marathons over 52 miles to finish that up. And that was, for me, that was 38 hours of non-stop pain. But what I learned about my pacing strategy and the fueling systems, and also just the psychological deprivation that I went through, was absolutely invaluable to the development, to my success in Antarctica. As well as that, we had, there was other parts of the development and the preparation. I was fortunate enough to have access to NASA satellites through my relationship with Antarctic Logistics and Expedition. And this photo is one of my favorite photos, actually. Actually, it's a ground-penetrating radar photo. Oh, I'm glad I said that, especially as we're live, of the ice sheet in Antarctica. And Antarctica, obviously, is covered by over 1 kilometre of glacial ice, and this has different flow rates. And being solo and unsupported meant that the consequences of making a mistake, the consequences of having a crevasse fall would be catastrophic. So being able to look at the different flow rates of the glacier, these on the photo, the red areas are faster moving glacier, the blue and darker areas are slow moving glaciers. We could highlight the shear zones, so I'd be aware of the glaciated terrain. But the next video I want to show you guys, if we could start playing the video now, is just what it's like in Antarctica. It seems insane, all the work that I went through in the 2 years building up to this. Some people think it's crazy, but actually it's what it requires to perform in these environments. And not just to be successful, but to be safe, because coming home is non-negotiable and the consequences for mistakes can be catastrophic. This day is one of the toughest days I had on the expedition. This day was around a 12 or 14-hour day, a brutal day skiing into whiteout. And as you can see here, what that means is no contrast, no horizon, just a complete and utter blast of your senses, and very much sensory deprivation. The only thing I could go on that day was just looking at my compass mounted on my chest in front of me and just going through those 1 hour and 15-minute blocks that I learned from the brutal event. And my alarm clock, I would start the day at 7. My first alarm would go off at 8:15, 9:35, 10:55, 12:15, 1:35, 3:15, 4:35, 5:55, 7:15, 8:35, and these were 1 hour and 20 minute blocks. That was 1 hour and 15 minutes skiing, moving, and a 5-minute rest. And I was absolutely dialed into this. If I didn't have time to do what I needed to do in that 5 minutes, it simply didn't be done. Whether that was eating, peeing, drinking, pooing, it was an absolutely precise military operation. Because although physical performance was vital in this expedition, the psychology and the systems and the discipline and the efficiency throughout those 29 days was equally as vital. That was a bad day. This was a good day, although good conditions-wise, but the terrain the year I was there was particularly challenging. And people think Antarctica is this flat, barren expanse, and it is very much so, but the sastrugi makes life really difficult. And these are the snow and ice features that are carved from the wind, and they can be absolutely brutal. And why, the injury resilience and all the biomechanical and prehabilitation work was so vital, because on skis you can see it's very easy to twist a knee or twist an ankle or something similar. On the January the 4th this year, I can't stop smiling when I say it, I returned home, becoming the fastest solo, unsupported and unassisted expedition by Britain from the coast of Antarctica to the South Pole. The first Welshman to complete the purest form of Antarctic journey as well. And a number as well. Obviously, those are the PR numbers. Those are the numbers that I'm proud of, don't get me wrong. But a number that really, really resonates with me is the number 17, because I'm privileged enough to have stood on the summit of Everest, to have achieved many things. But to put it into context, over 2,000 people have summited Everest, and that is an incredibly tiny amount considering the entire population of the world as we speak it in history. But actually, only 17 people have ever completed a coast-to-pole journey solo and unsupported. And to be, irrespective of being the fastest or the first Welshman, just to be part of that privileged cohort, that privileged company of men, is amazing, and something I'm really grateful and proud for. Obviously, I worked very hard for it too, but I'm very grateful too. I finished the expedition over 12 kilograms down in body weight. I know we're going to talk a little further about this. And some of the data that I collected throughout the expedition and pre-expedition, working with the guys here at the GSK HPL, is absolutely fascinating. And I'm incredibly passionate about performance, and I'm really passionate about the science that goes behind it as well. And I'm really excited to be able to share these details with you guys today. So that's a brief synopsis of the last 6 years of my life, and I'm looking forward to getting into the detail and geeking out with you guys today.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much,
Cheers,
Richard. I mean, it's an incredibly inspiring story, and everything you've achieved, but particularly culminating in being the fastest Brit and second fastest in history to achieve that journey. We're also joined on the panel today by our sports dietitian, Anton Solanas, also our performance scientist, Tess Morris, and neuroscientist, Dr. Barry O'Neill. So thank you, folks. Before we get into the meat of the expedition itself, maybe we could just talk about the preparation, just briefly. One of the words that came out quite consistently there was the word deprivation. You clearly thrive on deprivation and tough times. But Barry, perhaps from a neuroscience perspective, you could just flesh out a little bit more about what Richard was going through and how this could have been preparing him.
Sure, Ken. As Richard's touched on already, the psychological preparation, so the belief that you can do the expedition, or you can do, I guess, the physical work that's going to be asked of you on an expedition of this type is very important. But I think traditionally, or to now, physiologists and sports scientists thought that the limitations of endurance exercise were physiologically driven. And of course, well, there's two camps, I guess. Some people thought it was centrally driven, some people thought it was peripherally driven. There's recent research out by one of our collaborators, Samuel Marcora, and he believes it's a psychobiological model. So it has components in two camps, but essentially it's driven by your perception of effort. So essentially what Rich was doing, I believe, when he was doing his deprivation training, is pushing his perception of effort. So how much he suffers, or how much he pushes himself in the brutal, in the yak attack, all these expeditions, is basically pushing his limits. So psychologically, he has the belief that he can do what he can do, but also biologically, he knows what it feels like. He knows where his limits are. And while for some of us that can be doing 45 minutes in the gym, well, Rich is obviously clearly further along that spectrum. But essentially, it's that perception of effort that is really a new and developing area of science. But people like Rich have been doing this for years, and this is how they achieve what they're achieving, but we're really delving into the neurobiology behind that now.
And just picking up on one of the other points you raised, that's something else that I think gave you an awful lot of confidence, was the physiological assessments and seeing the numbers and seeing the objective evaluation. Tess, perhaps on a very broad perspective, can you comment on just the importance of this for athletes and coaches and why we do it?
Yeah, sure. I guess, being able to monitor, when we're talking physiological, it can be kind of a broad spectrum of what your body functions like, really. And interestingly enough, I guess for Rich in particular, coming from a rugby background, obviously he's an athlete that's highly developed to be able to repeat efforts very fast, very quickly, and be able to do that very effectively. And obviously that's got kind of nothing to do at all with being able to sustain effort for a prolonged period in somewhere like an extreme environment like Antarctica. So for him in particular, I think, but for any athlete, it's obviously really important to monitor over time and be able to make those tweaks and periodisation over the course of a season. For Rich in particular, I think, in preparation for something like this, absolutely imperative really that we make sure that we get that right and that he knows that he's transitioned into the kind of athlete that can, prepare and perform in those kinds of environments.
And Rich, there's so many factors there you have to prepare for it. It's the environment, it's the practicalities, it's the equipment, it's the fitness. How important was this scientific approach for you?
Oh, it was huge, and it was paramount to my success. I'm scientific and meticulous about my kit, my equipment, and I'm equally as meticulous about my own physiological and psychological preparation. And that confidence and the understanding of my body, especially having to be solo and self-sufficient, was absolutely paramount. And the final VO2 max test just before I left for Antarctica that we did here, was a huge line in the sand, and actually was an incredible experience for me, because I arrived, frazzled, tired, in the build-up to the expedition, all the media, and I did the test, and I remember finishing the test thinking, it didn't go very well. I didn't, I was just really hard on myself, and couldn't have done better. But actually, the numbers don't lie, and you can't hide from the numbers. And some people, that doesn't suit everybody. But for me, actually, just being able to see that where I was, and also being able to pull myself back at the points of the test when maybe I should have fallen off the bike, but I didn't. Really gave me a huge psychological boost. And really, science is an integral part of the psychological prep as well as the actual physiological prep as well.
So let's discuss the expedition itself. You mentioned it previously around the importance for recovery, but also for fueling, nutrition and diet. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about the approach you took, the energy intake, the type of foods you were taking, and interestingly, how you did things differently this time compared to some of the previous expeditions.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the challenge with expeditions is, you have to carry all the food and all the fuel that you need, and that's really different to, high performance sport where you've got, you've got physios, you've got dietitians running on during a game to give you meals, and obviously all the food's in the house when you get home. And this poses a really significant challenge. And the first time I went to Antarctica, my systems worked in the mountains. I have got that nailed. But the first time I went to Antarctica, it was a real challenge for me, because my calories were heavy front-loaded and heavy back-loaded into the day. So big breakfast, big evening meals, with very little throughout the day. And also the actual food, we assume a high-performance diet to be low in fat. But actually, I needed more fat. I didn't have enough fat in my fuel the first time, and I came home, you know, really emaciated, and it really affected my cognition as well as my physiological performance. So working with Anna, we devised, like I said, specific strategies for each of the deprivation events throughout the year. But for Antarctica, it was about a better combination of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, really giving my body the nutrients that it needed, and also a system that drip-fed the calories throughout the day. And this was a really important part of the recovery strategy, because part of the recovery strategy was not to dip too far into the red on any given day. And although I was burning approximately 8 to 10,000 calories a day, the equivalent of 2 marathons for somebody my size a day, and I was only carrying 5,815 calories a day, decided because of the weight to calorie ratio, it was a huge success.
Anna, perhaps you could comment on the more continual feeding through the day, and perhaps some insights around the level of protein in Rich's diet as well.
Yeah, sure. There were several things that were done very well, I think, in terms of the nutrition. The first one was that Rich was having feedings quite often, so every 75 minutes, this slots that he was talking about on resting, he was eating, and he was eating a flat jab that was quite rich in carbohydrates, but also quite rich in protein. And having this continuous feeding, it was being beneficial in terms of maintaining his glucose level at an adequate level in blood, etc., and also getting enough protein continuously in the body to make sure that his recovery later in the day was going to be good. Also, the amount of protein he was having was higher than the one observed in previous expeditions years ago. Not his expeditions, but traditionally, Antarctic exploration or exploration in general has been providing a really high fat diet. And this has a benefit that the volume of food you have to take is smaller due to the higher calorie present in fat. It's not ideal for performance, and Rich's diet was quite high in carbohydrates and higher in protein than some of the traditional expeditions. So he was having between 1.8, 2.2 grams per kilo of body weight of protein per day, depending on the point of the expedition. At the beginning of the expedition, when he was around 90 kilos, obviously it would be around 1.8, but as he was losing weight, the quantity per kilo was a bit higher. And I think this was very important as well for his performance.
Great, so we've had a bit there in terms of energy intake, but how about energy expenditure? Tess, I know one of the things we've tried to do is quantify energy expenditure and, if you like, the physical or physiological demands of the event. What are some of the challenges in doing that?
Well, I think anyone working in sport will find, quantifying load an issue anyway in general. If you then times that by 1,000 working in somewhere like Antarctica, where you're in the most extreme conditions on Earth, then you start to think, well, actually, those challenges you have as a sports practitioner working in other sports where you can control the environment actually aren't that great, really. Rich had a certain number of pieces of equipment, obviously having global positioning from, satellites at NASA, so being able to measure his precise location and distance over time, that was absolutely critical. And also, obviously being able to measure time in general. And it sounds really stupid, but if you're able to measure those two things, then that at least gives us a notional idea of what he was doing. That obviously doesn't give us a huge amount of data compared to a lot of other sports you might be able to measure. And also, given the other challenges around sort of friction of the ice, different conditions of the ice, you noticed that Rich's slide before in terms of the undulating sort of conditions and the type of conditioning that he did to kind of... Upgulating, yeah, literally, in terms of that explosive strength that he needs as well. And then thinking about his weight changes and also the weight changes of the sled up to 70k that he needed to carry, that starts to look like quite a significant challenge, really. So if you look at the graph, actually, that kind of is as much information as we can possibly get from an environment like this. So you can see the kind of time that he spent, the sleep that he got over time as well, and the distance that he travelled. And for us, actually, that's incredibly important. You then add things like wind speed, and he was talking about, his nose and the wind speed and the direction that it travels in and the kind of challenges there. That starts to look like a really interesting challenge, and hopefully in the future we can start to measure those things, slightly more accurately. But tricky given the environment.
That's obviously some training load, if we can call it that. So that number of hours of moving probably certainly doesn't do it justice, the physical intensity that you were going through. But what sort of impact did that load have on your mood and motivation?
Huge is the answer. I mean, my emotions were a roller coaster daily. And people will say, I was stoic, I was focused, and you are. I mean, I was committed to the expedition. I'd worked bloody hard to get there. A lot of people had put a lot of time and effort and belief into me getting there, and letting them down was non-negotiable. But the reality is, it's really difficult. And when you're performing at that level with that level of exertion, every single emotion is just put under a microscope. And then when you've got the added challenge of an environment that's actively trying to prevent you from achieving your goal, it was an emotional roller coaster. And some days, were tough, and it was really, really had to grind it out and grind every hour out and every step out. And other days, really felt like I was weightless, and really felt like the performance came together.
And certainly in such a hostile environment, your decision-making capacity is going to be critical. So Barry, what sort of impact would this continuous load over a significant number of days, what sort of impact might that have on decision-making and cognitive function?
Well, that's the key part when you said might there, Ken, because we don't really know. A lot of the previous work that's been done in expeditions of this type tend to look at brain function, decision making prior to and post the expedition, which of course is the best we could do, I suppose, previously, because it's tricky, as Tess's point about measuring physiological load is the same, measuring cognitive load and decision making. So what happens if you measure pre and post is, if you leave the ice and a couple of days, those effects that you've had on the brain function could have resolved and you could be back to your baseline. So it would seem nothing's happened in between, but as Rich has attested, things do happen in between, and you have to be, and I guess that's part of his training previously, is to improve his cognitive function, to be able to function in these extreme environments. So a lot of the previous work as well has also measured subjective responses. So with those subjective responses are asking people how they feel, different moods, different emotions. And while that's really useful, and it's also tracking sleep and energy levels, and we did that with Rich, and I think a lot of the stuff followed, I guess, if you like, the directions you'd expect. You slept less as the expedition went on, no surprise there, but actually you slept quite a lot more than some of the expeditions I've seen in the literature. So some of the previous expeditions in Antarctica, there's a case study by Pedler and a group from St. Mary's. They looked at a particular lady who did the Antarctic expedition. She slept about an average of 5 hours a night across her expedition. Your average is about 7, and then a range of about 5 to 10. So I guess that shows that your meticulous nature around your camp and your tent and the amount of exercise you were doing, you slept like a baby most nights, I would imagine. And then we also had the mood measure, and as Rich said, his mood was a roller coaster, and that was reflected in his subjective responses to a point. So the early days where you mightn't have covered too much distance, that affected you, and we know that, we've spoken to you before. And then as the expedition went on, you were, if you looked at the data and on paper, you were overwhelmingly positive, which is true as well, because even though you were tired, and you've mentioned this previously, you wanted to keep that positive frame of mind. So subjective responses, monitoring things like that are very important. It gives us an insight into cognitive function during the expedition, but as we'll touch on later, we implemented a new strategy with Rich.
And I know one of the other things we measured was muscle soreness, and maybe if there's time in the Q&A, if anyone would like to ask, we can pick up on some of the recovery strategies you employed, because you did mention previously compression socks and electrical stimulation devices, so maybe we can pick up on that later. But Tess, one of the other things we did, and Rich, you mentioned, you very kindly took the time to take some salivary samples for us.
Did I have a choice?
Which we brought back. And so perhaps Tess, as as a measure of, if you like, the internal load or the stress response on the body. Perhaps you could talk us through what we see here.
Yeah, sure. So we've discussed already that, you know, physiological load is extremely difficult to be able to monitor in these kinds of environments. And we also needed something that was relatively light. So, you know, Rich was meticulous in terms of his weight that he carried around with him, of course. So we didn't want anything that was going to kind of add to that at all throughout the expedition. So what we did is looked at salivary diagnostics and testosterone and cortisol in particular. As you can see from the graph, so the black line is the testosterone and the dotted line is cortisol. And as you can see, it's kind of an atypical response, really. Testosterone is the you know, hormone that we tend to look at in terms of overtraining or, you know, training response when it starts to get you know, prolonged fatigue. It's quite good in terms of monitoring that over time, and various football clubs and rugby clubs, for example, will do exactly that. But that was perfect for us in this environment as well, given that the saliva also needs to be kept in a condition like Antarctica is perfect for that, really.
In the freezer.
In the freezer, yeah, exactly. So it was perfect for those kinds of conditions as well. And then cortisol is a stress hormone response, so the kind of endocrine response, which is also related to psychological and physiological load. So that's interesting in terms of the mix between the two. And going through Rich's blog and speaking to Rich about his anecdotes throughout the time, you know, we can attribute cortisol often to physiological load, you know, when we know consistency and what's going on exactly, but also in terms of psychological load and thinking about any kind of stress responses that happened to Rich over that time, and having his anecdotes aligned with the, you know, salivary measures has been extremely interesting, and probably more so scientifically absolutely brilliant, but also just anecdotally, you know, just excellent to hear as well. Okay, so then we move on to TC response. So testosterone-cortisol ratio is something that's, you know, typically used in terms of the literature as well. And again, you can kind of see a really typical response. If you just focus on the expedition in terms of that 30 days, you can really see that sort of decline in the TC ratio as well. So for us as scientists, kind of getting this data back from someone that's been to Antarctica, done something as extreme as this in terms of the, you know, the length of the days that you were travelling and the amount of load that you were going under. It's not often that we can get these kinds of data from someone that's doing something like this. So for us, this is absolutely fantastic and really interesting for us to see as well.
And Barry, maybe perhaps now we could come back to some of the cognitive assessments we undertook. Perhaps just explain what we did and why.
Sure, Ken. So with our partners, Axon Sports, we developed an application for Rich. So Rich brought an iPad along with him, which again we were very grateful for, because given that, you know, weight is paramount, it was important, and it was really useful for us to have that. But what we tried to build was not just to ask Rich a question, which would be looking at his cognitive function during the expedition, which is different to previous expeditions, but also we customized the app for Rich, so to form part of this psychological, I guess, motivational quotes were included in the app. We had some music in the app that Rich liked to listen to. So all the while, we would hope that Rich would look forward to doing the application. And so what we got from that was we got an action every 3 days during the expedition. We had some issues with the data, which we're not sure why. It could have been the cold, but we got some data back. And from that, there's a really interesting view of a biomarker that we're looking at the GSK Human Performance Lab for readiness to train and compete, and that's a reaction time-based biomarker. So one of the tasks that Rich did within the whole battery of tasks that we got to do was simple reaction time tasks.
So before we take a look at the data, maybe we can throw that back to you, Rich, in terms of was it worth lugging a mini tablet around with you? What did you get from it, and how did it feel in terms of ease of use and practicalities?
It was most definitely worth it. I was committed and passionate about the science and the research that we were undertaking. It really didn't affect me at all, if I'm being honest. I wouldn't say I look forward to it, but I wouldn't say I didn't look forward to it either. You know, it was all about the mindset and the system and the routines of the day, that it was literally part of the day, and it was something that I had to do in order to finish that. My entire days, my existence for that period was all process driven, and it was all about doing something more efficiently, more quickly that time than the last time. And interestingly enough, it was that controlled my mood more than anything, regardless of fatigue or the physiological markers. It was just being successful at that one process that controlled my mood. So it was wonderful.
And certainly what's novel about this is having a technology that we can now actually go and measure cognitive function during the expedition rather than perhaps relying on pre and post measures, as Barry just previously mentioned. So let's take a look at the data then, Barry. Perhaps you could talk us through this.
Well, and I'll take ambivalence, Rich. That's fine. If you want to be so-so about my apps, as long as you do them, that's fine. So the data we captured, again, similar to the hormonal analysis data, not as many data points as I said because we had some issues with the data on the back end. But you can see we split into pre-expedition, the first attempt, and the expedition itself. And you can see there's a general slowing of reaction time as we go across the several days that he was out in Antarctica. And that's that was our hypothesis initially that was driving this work, was that a simple reaction time marker could be a biomarker of readiness to train and compete or general physiological fatigue. Because I believe there's three components to it. There is the cognitive component, which is, taking the information in, processing it. Possibly a neuromuscular component, which can be actually eliciting a response. And then also a general the marker is probably sensitive to a general physiological fatigue, so your overall level of fatigue. And I think those three things then they probably load onto a lot of different markers of fatigue, but this particular one, for us, the hypothesis was that it would be sensitive, and it seems that it's turned out that way. And this was an initial piece of data with Rich that we've since implemented with several other expeditions we've supported. So the Marathon des Sables, the Race Across America with Hugh Pillinger, and also there's one other one, which I've forgotten, I think. Was it MDS and Hugh Pillinger? It'll come back to me. And we've also, but I guess the big question is, it showed similar results in these expeditions, but now we're asking the question, as to Tessa's point earlier, about a lot of people within professional clubs and sports are measuring load within players to try and get that balance between training and recovery correct. And we're hoping this could be another marker that could be used in those environments, which are a lot more controlled than the extremes of Antarctica and other expeditions. So what we want to know is, are these markers sensitive in these environments? And if they are sensitive for day-to-day training for a professional athlete, could they also be predictive? So you see a change in this particular marker, and then that will let you know that a physical change is on the way or some other kind of change. So those are the kind of relationships we're looking at currently.
So obviously plenty more work being done and to be done, and we'll be disseminating and publishing this work and sharing it with our expert community audience in the very near future. So we've spoken about energy intake, energy expenditure, some of the acute stresses on the body. Perhaps as we come to the end of it, the longer term impact on you, and particularly in terms of how much weight you lost and how much physical strength you feel you lost. Perhaps you could just talk to us about that.
I think that with perspective, it was a huge success. I finished the expedition, a shell of the man that I started, but that was expected. That's what it requires, that type of expedition in that type of environment. I finished 12 kilos down, but as a result of the work that I did in preparation, through the physiological training, the cognitive work, the work managing my diet and my fueling, I actually gained some lean muscle mass around that expedition with such a huge calorie deficit. So, and ultimately, I came back in one piece and haven't been successful. So it was tough. I think psychologically it's taken me 7-8 months to recover, is the honest truth. It took me longer to recover psychologically than it did physiologically. But it was just a brutally wonderful experience.
And of course, you measured a pre to post loss of 12 kilograms. Unfortunately, although we collected data with you during the expedition, we weren't able to come with you and put you through a DEXA scan the day you started and the day you finished. So, Anna, I know some of the data that we have from the DEXA scanner is slightly different. If you could just talk us through what we found, and bear in mind it was a few weeks before, or a few days before Richard left, and maybe a few weeks after he completed the expedition.
Yes, due to the nature of the expedition, we had to do our measurements sometime before he left to Chile, and sometime after he came back. So it was 87 days between our measurements, which is not ideal, but is as best as we could do. So what we measured, it was 5.3 kilos different. It makes absolute sense because once he finished and he started eating again, and I know he was hungry all the time because I remember when we went to do the DEXA scan, we were in that taxi and he was begging me for food before the scan, and I was telling him to wait a little bit until we finished. So he recovered very quickly some of the weight, but still we saw very interesting results. We did a full profile skin folds that we had to modify at the end because he had some frostbite, and we have interesting data that we'll disseminate later or early next year. And around the DEXA, it was very interesting to see in terms of fat percentage. So the graph that you can see is showing percentage change in different areas of the body. So you can appreciate that changes in fat were quite big. So the fat in the 3 different compartments that are measured by DEXA, legs, arms, and trunk, decreasing more than 30%, arms being nearly 40%. And we had a very interesting finding that it's not the first time that it's been found. So some other expeditions found an increase in lean mass after the expedition, but really modest increases in lean mass. Overall, Rich increased around 1.3 kilos of lean mass in the body, being around 3 kilos increased in the trunk. And it was quite surprising. We were not expecting an increase in lean mass as high as this one, but he decreased his lean mass in legs and arms. So it was surprising. It was very good to see. And it's not the first time we're seeing this kind of response with extreme athletes that we're working with. And still really interesting, and I'm looking forward to be able to measure this in future expeditions with Rich or with some other athletes that we can work with, because it's amazing to see these results.
Great, thank you. So we do have time now to go to some questions, and we've got a number of questions coming in from the audience live. But what's been really fascinating here is the opportunity to work with you for someone who is doing incredible things. Thanks. But also committed to collecting data and the scientific inquiry around it as well. And I hope what we've shared so far has been of value and interest to you, the audience. Certainly we'll be writing up and publishing the data in far more detail in due course at conference and journal publications. But let's go through some of the questions. And the first question I'm going to pick out is, what type of equipment could be taken to the pole to look at it and measure physiological responses? And I'm going to throw that one to Tess, because there's something that you might want to include in there about how we might be able to do some body composition assessments going forwards as well.
Yeah, sure. So, you know, as Anna's alluded to, the data that we got back in terms of the DEXA pre and post is absolutely phenomenal, and really highlights kind of the uniqueness of potentially Rich actually as an individual, but also what can be achieved if you get your nutritional strategies correct as well, which he clearly did do. As part of GSK, one of my projects is to work on a new methodology to measure muscle mass, looking at a deuterium labelled creatine pill. So that's essentially just a slightly different labelled pill to then measure total creatine and then look at muscle mass from that total measure. And something like that is extremely unique and something that we have developed here. But also secondly, you know, provides us a great opportunity to measure someone that's doing something in this extreme environment on an ongoing basis. So just requiring a urine sample, for instance, that obviously will be frozen in that environment too. And you know, allows us to really look specifically over that time period at how that muscle mass changes, because I think that would be fairly critical in terms of a turning point potentially within the expedition where it does change, or how he has accumulated that mass over time as well, particularly in the trunk. I think that was particularly interesting. So that's one of the things we're looking at.
Great, thank you. Richard, there's a question just come in now asking, how much time did you spend in the environmental chamber preparing? And how long were you in there for, and at what sort of intensity?
Mixed amounts. I spent probably a day or two here in the environmental chamber analysing my sweat. That was primarily for the events leading up to Antarctica, but obviously all the data informed the entire 18 months, 2 years of the project. But for me, I also spent time in the environmental chamber at the University of South Wales as well, but that was developing the camera equipment and the systems needed to operate the cameras in down to minus 42 degrees. But for me, you know, it was about performing here, and there are no shortcuts. You know, there are no shortcuts to experiencing what it's like to be, you know, to be shattered. It doesn't do it justice, to be absolutely empty and have to pitch a tent, to ski for 14 hours and then, you know, realize that you're only a few kilometers off your marker, so you have to ski further, and all these things. And that's why I went to Antarctica first of all, because in my opinion, there's no shortcut to recreating that. But the work I did here was a vital tool in being able, you know, to prepare for that, and played a huge cog in it.
And again, in terms of your preparation, someone's asking, what mental technique proved most effective for coping through the toughest times?
You know, as Barry spoke earlier, you know, I think there are a number of tools that I personally use to develop resilience. The first one is putting myself through periods of deprivation. And it's fascinating to hear, you know, Barry say that irreversibly changes my perception of what I'm capable of, which it absolutely does. You know, and then for me, everything was process driven. So the whole day, you know, a 12-hour day, it's not just skiing for 12 hours, it's broken down into 1 hour and 15 minutes. But although this is a solo project, I don't see it as a solo project. And although what I do now is very different to the life I had as a professional rugby player, and I tease Barry and Tess and Anna, but actually being part of a team is very important to me, and it's a huge driver. And I see this as a team project that I did the last 1,150 kilometers solo. So actually, you know, having to get up and do the cognitive data collection, having to, you know, take the saliva samples, you know, knowing the work that Anna put in, when I'm out there, when it's minus 30 and I don't want to get up, I've got another 40k to ski, and there's ice coming from the inside of the tent with my humidity freezing, the humidity from my breath freezing. Getting out my sleeping bag is driven by not letting people down.
Great. Okay, so given time, I'm afraid, despite a whole lot more questions coming in, we are going to have to leave it there. But what I would like to do to just in terms of closing is thank you to the HPL staff, panel members, for a fascinating and insightful discussion. Particular thanks to Rich for joining us today, but also the privilege and the pleasure of working with you, and the opportunity it gives us as scientists the chance to better understand the limits of human performance.
Well, I hope this is just the beginning.
I hope so too, thank you. And to you, the audience, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for your questions. Apologies again that we haven't been able to address all of them. But I am now able to announce the two winners of Rich Parks' book, his biography, that is a fabulous read, I can assure you, having just finished it myself. And those winners are Ralph Gordon and Karen Weeks. So we will be emailing them to get your postal address to make sure we send them out to you, and you'll be receiving them very soon. So that draws this webcast to a close. Thank you again. Please do keep visiting our expert community at gskhpl.com. Please do provide any feedback you have through our help desk there on the website on this event and indeed any others. And do keep a lookout for our final e-bulletin of 2014, which will be out in the next week or two. So goodbye for now.